Okay, forgive me for speaking in English, but I gather the conference is in English. I would not inflict my German upon you. And also let me thank particularly Udo, who can't be with us, the wonderful people who just introduced me, and Jenny for being such a great organizer of this conference, which you'll all benefit from, I'm sure, in the next few days. I won't be able to answer the questions that have just been put, but maybe make some suggestions. And I'll do so in relation to my friend Okwi Mwezo. I'm honored to speak to you because this is one of the great museums of the world. I'm doubly honored to speak in the place of my dear and departed friend. We were very close in spirit, so close it goes back to 1997 when we were co-curators of global conceptualism. And we were also very close in our thinking, which you'll hear as we go through today's talk. But I can only be a poor substitute for him when it comes to matters of curating, being an art historian and a writer on art, but an occasional curator. So I ask you to forgive me for that in the beginning. So Okwi was no saint. He doesn't deserve hagiography. The problems we're facing don't deserve generalization. They can't be generalized. But they have to be worked through in their particularity. But in order to do that, as you just mentioned, methodology, some forms, some senses of kinds of approaches, different kinds of approaches, it's important to try and lay them out. So I want to begin in a fairly personal way by telling you some of the things we spoke about in the last 5 or 6 days of his life at his bedside in Munich. I'll just say 2 of them. They may surprise some of you, but I chose them because they take us through this very personal time tunnel to the main issues before us in this conference. They were both things that he often said, and they serve as key markers of his identity, amongst many other things. The first was his frequent declaration that among museums, he loved above all the Metropolitan Museum in New York, which may amaze many of you. Of course, he was aware of its gilded history, of it being a citadel to the power of money, to the power of the West, and to Eurocentric worldviews. And of course, the United States, of which I'm now also a citizen, has acted as a colonizing power compared to its European counterparts, much less through direct conquest, much more through its money power. He knew the exclusions in his bones upon which edifices such as the Metropolitan were built. As a black man and someone who was more interested, in many ways more brilliant than most of his peers, he'd experienced the exclusions time and time again that are the understructure of these institutions. They always gave him pause, and he always had to work around them, sometimes in ways that disturbed and disrupted and hurt others. But in it, nothing stopped him. So how are we to understand what he was valuing in a place like the Met? When the Civil War broke out in Nigeria in 1967, Okwi was not 4 years old. Soon his family was obliged to flee for their lives, most of them going to England. In the early 80s, he moved to the United States to study political science at Jersey City State College, not one of the most prestigious institutions. The Met is still a dazzling place for all of us, but for a 20-year-old beginning to discover himself as a poet, it has enormous impact, could have enormous impact. So wonder in a place like the Met. And for some of us, openness to wonder never disappears, no matter how many museums we might visit. So it was with Okwi. In our conversations, and more importantly, in our visits to museums together, The main excitement was to be able to move from one sequence of rooms to another, from one civilizational stream to another, from one culture to another adjacent or distant one, from one kind of art to many other kinds. He would delight at walking through a museum at angles to the plan, of the museum. So vast-scale museums like the Met afford a myriad of in-between spaces. They mostly do it by accident. The in-between spaces, and if we work, as you go at these angles, if you work against the grain of normal and normalizing narratives, those of the great schools and epics of art history, or of the archaeologists' accounts of the human evolution, or even those told by the museum about itself, which is a very common thing for museums to talk about their growth, their history, their donors, their collections. So while it's obviously the case that much art is experienced, and richly so, inside these stories, there is art to be found in between these stories, when the historical adjacency of seemingly separated flows is remembered, and when the real worlds, the actual actions of people and peoples that gave rise to the art on display, when that comes actually back into our imaginations. So there's that about wonder. But in time, the wonder diminishes. And you remember that the art that you know which is not in these museums, or at least not in the so-called universal art history museums, those that claim to be showing the history of art as such. You remember that art. And you look around for explanations of why there's a limited range of art on display. And after years of institutional critique, you wonder about what's hidden in the collections. And one of the experiences I think that you may have had is that you find there's not that much hidden. Actually, the collections are usually filled with more of the same, more of what's on display, not with the excluded differences. So a classic example right now in the Met. They're doing what many museums are doing. They're looking at their collections and turning them into exhibitions. So this is the exhibitionary character of museum collections nowadays. Their celebrated collection of masterpieces by 17th century Dutch artists have been made into an exhibition in praise of painting. Next to this amazing painting, which was very controversial when it was bought, there's a wall text. And this is the wall text. I'll just read you one part. I'm not sure I have a pointer, but it's the second paragraph. Dutch paintings were amongst the first works purchased by the Met after its founding in 1870. Subsequent gifts and purchases built one of the world's great collections of Dutch art, focusing on three towering figures, Rembrandt, of course, Frans Hals and Vermeer. There are, of course, blind spots in the story of these particular acquisitions. Colonialism, slavery, and war, major themes in 17th century Dutch history, are scarcely visible here. And only one picture by an early modern Dutch woman has entered the collection over a period of nearly 150 years. Of course, they didn't show that painting. So there you have this huge amount of history left out of this exhibition, but gestured at in just a couple of lines. But not at least, it's very small. This is a feeble gesture. It's a gesture. It's not one that the Met has made very often in recent years, but maybe under Max Hollein, your ex-colleague, maybe it will make some more. There's a deeper dimension to this, one that's not reducible to to anger at the lack of African art in museums, for example, or its relegation to rooms devoted to other earlier civilizations, although that anger is there, and it is a righteous anger. The deeper dimension emerges from my second story that may be relevant to us. He surprised me once by saying that he greatly enjoyed the exhibition Primitivism in 20th century art, Affinity of the Tribal and Modern, shown at Moma in 1984. Here's an installation of a famous room in this very well-known exhibition. In fact, it's an infamous exhibition, attracting considerable opprobrium for being highly primitivist, for relegating the arts of Africa and everywhere non-Western to the role of one amongst other inspirations for European or US modernism. And they're the works along the wall, no signs for them, and then images, wall text underneath showing you the works from which inspired Picasso. Oakley said, "I didn't know I was supposed to dislike it." So here's a simple personal factor operating here. We've got a 21-year-old poet, poli-sci student, enchanted to see all this wonderful art by artists from his continent and by indigenous peoples from around the world. And I happen to know because one of our postgraduates worked on David Neal, wrote a book about David Neal, who was in this show, a cockatiel artist from northwest Canada, who was really pleased to have a work of his in the contemporary exploration section of this show. And many non-Western artists and magicians de la terre were pleased to be in that show, despite its colonial structure. At that point, Oakley was not yet aggrieved by the odious, condescending comparison staged throughout this exhibition. He would soon become conscious that they exemplified a kind of segregation. This is a word that Mick Wilson is using in a book that just came out, What About Activism? Worth reading his essay. He's writing about Gothenburg, so segregation. A kind of segregation specific to the evolution of international modernism. Resistance to this segregation, in the name of equal access to human rights, would become the driving force of the rest of Oakley's career. So I'll just remind you of one instance of this. Of course, it'll be documentary 11. It's salutary for us to recall that his ambitions for that documenta, included an absolutely capacious sense of what an exhibition could and indeed should encompass. I'll just quote from him from the black box, from his introduction, while you look at him there at the time he wrote it. The collected result, in the form of a series of volumes and the exhibition itself, is placed at the dialectical intersection of contemporary art and culture. Such an intersection equally marks the liminal limits out of which the post-colonial, post-Cold War, post-ideological, transnational, deterritorialized, diasporic global world has been written. So there's a fault, quoting every name of every movement that happens to be happening at that time. Nonetheless, he believed and absorbed the energies behind all those names. This dialectical enterprise attempts to establish concrete and imaginative links with the various projects of modernity. Their impact, as well as their material and symbolic ordering, is woven through the procedures of translation, interpretation, subversion, hybridization, creolization, displacement, and reassemblage. What emerges in this transformation in different parts of the world produces a critical ordering of intellectual and artistic networks of the globalizing world. The exhibition as a diagnostic toolbox actively seeks to stage the relationships, conjunctions, and disjunctions between different realities, between artists, institutions, disciplines, genres, generations, processes, forms, media activities, between identity and subjectification. Linked together, the exhibition counterpoises the supposed purity and autonomy of the art object against a rethinking of modernity based in ideas of transculturality and extraterritoriality. Thus, the exhibition project of the fifth platform is less a receptacle of commodity objects than a container of the plurality of voices, a material reflection on a series of disparate and interconnected actions and processes. The black box, there's a manifesto for a truly global exhibition. Is it a manifesto for a truly global art museum? Maybe it is. At least it was in 2002. I think the most articulate version of it you could find. But the exhibition itself told us a lot more. The entrance, you remember, was framed on either side by the work of these two artists. Hanadaboven, connecting the two of them in between. Flores work produced in Paris, in exile from Iran, all her work destroyed. She showed the products of her time there in exile, destroyed. Deeply personal projection. Matched with that, a public horror, the invasion of a major public building in Bogota, initially by FARC, and then the local police and army who shot everybody, 83 people inside the building, 84 people inside the building. Which Doris Salcedo evokes that experience through using the furniture from the building and fusing it together and creating elsewhere some bars and blocks of doorways and so on. Just two examples of an exhibition that constantly put the private and the public experiences of world forces against each other. Put them in conflict, put them in contrast, played them off against each other, moved them towards the abstractions that Hanadaboven evokes in her work. That kind of interplay was extraordinary. So of course Documenta 11 was not even the first, nor was it the only post-colonial mega exhibition, but it remains, I think, the most influential one. For me, it's a paradigm of what I call the co-temporal, historical and critical exhibition, which is a type that's emerged as definitive of much contemporary exhibition making. I'm writing something at the moment that tries to pick out 5 different tendencies within large-scale exhibition making in our contemporary context. And this is one. We're today in effect speaking about just one kind. There are at least 4 other kinds. Oakley was the leading theorist of this approach, and indeed you can find him laying out his theory for this way of exhibition making in a lecture in the city, he gave in the city at Humboldt University on December the 4th, 2001, while the platforms of Documenta 11 were in full swing. It's the it's the text called Groß Ausstellungen und die Entnomien einer transnationalen globalen Form. You see why I'm not giving this lecture in German. It's published in Munich in 2002. Oakley never got the chance to test out his ideas in a major collecting museum. He did so, of course, in a major Kunsthalle at the Haus der Kunst, where he introduced a program of multiple exhibitions of many types, aiming for that experience of in-betweenness that I mentioned before. The results were spectacular. They were inspiring. They were also very challenging. They didn't always work, but often they did. This juxtaposition of different kinds of exhibition, and we wished there were more of them. In a conversation we had in Munich in 2013, published 2 years later in my book, Talking Contemporary Curating, he said that, and you can see it there. To me, the fundamental challenges that a curator faces today are how to provoke and engage confrontation with works of art, how to make that experience legible, and how to use it to open up forms of engagement with the world. Exhibitions, in this sense, open up the surplus value of art. They create value of many kinds, simply because each time artworks are exhibited, they accrue new meaning, new force, open out new possibilities, while not necessarily changing their shape. In turn, art changes the perceptions of those it engages. So, to make an exhibition is to theorize the place of art, not only in institutions, but also in public spaces, and, if you will, in the world. The language, compared to what I read out earlier, is interestingly different, isn't it? There's a trajectory there. A different language is emerging. But the world he's conjuring is one in which rights are shared by all, a world in which art has a pivotal role to play in highlighting those rights and in sustaining them. So there are my remarks about how Oakley, I think, leads us into the key questions which will be the main focus of my address. And I'll do so under this heading. Something of the spirit that I've been talking about must have inspired the German Federal Cultural Foundation. It clearly did. We've just heard what the spirit was. When you approach German museums with the proposal that they examine their respective collections in regard to, and I quote, long neglected global relationships between artists, art trends and artworks, and offered 3.2 million euros for people to do so. As Jörg Heiser, who I hope is here, and if he is, you're about to be quoted, as Jörg put it in his review of the Homo World's exhibition in Frieze magazine last year, I quote him, in other more direct terms, to take critical questions of decolonisation on board. Well put. The thing is, open your institutions to the world's peoples, admit them, and in the words of your Chancellor, which I quote in front of you, for someone from Australia, for someone from the United States, for someone anywhere outside Germany, these words were very moving. I was moved to tears to hear these words. Not only because they have a simple moral purity, which is so rare these days. Whatever other things you might think about your Chancellor, this is a moment to savour, I think. Because whether she was aware of it or not, she was speaking not just in the words of the nation of Germany, she was speaking in the world's voice. The world's voice is the voice of the Global Museum. That's what has to be found. So we go back. The Global Art Museum project, led by Hans Belting, Andrea Budenzeig and Peter Weibel between 2006 and 2014, which I believe you also funded. I thank you for that. I believe they are here, and I'm honoured to be in their presence. They pursued the issues involved more thoroughly and on a wider geographic scale than all previous art historical inquiries. Noting that Western museums, scholars and collectors, as well as many artists and teachers, had hitherto treated non-Western art as ahistorical and as ethnic, compared to the historically unfolding, universally relevant quote-unquote art of the West, Hans Belting argued that living artists from these parts of the world now feel, at that time, that their art is post-historical in a way and post-ethnic, that they were intent on creating what he called a global art, an art that was contemporary with that being made in Europe and America, and was in itself as specific and as valuable in itself as art being made anywhere. He argued against the concept of world art because he saw that as a term coined in Europe, tainted by its history within colonialism, so preferred the term global art at that point. The culmination of the Global Art Museum project, which of course appeared in these books, major books full of writings from artists and curators and critics, artists from around the world. The culmination was of course this exhibition at Karlsruhe in 2011. The curators, Hans Belting, Andrea Budenzeig, as I said, and Peter Weibel, insisted that they wanted to highlight the importance, I quote, of a global practice that has changed contemporary art as radically as new media had done previously, which is a pretty big thing to say at ZKM, you know. Some commentators were worried that it's not up to a white Europeans to say who's global and who isn't. That's a fair comment, I think. That's a fair comment. But on the other hand, several contemporary artists explicitly state that achieving not so much a global art, but an art of globality, there's a big difference between those two, is their goal. In fact, their goal. One of them, of course, is Raak's Media Collective. I showed 2 works by them, including one that was in that exhibition. And many have globality, achieving a kind of art that is genuinely of the world today, of our world today, as a goal. Oakley identified the will to globality amongst peoples in his black box essay I quoted from before, expanded the idea in his classic essay, The Post-Colonial Constellation, which you can find in our book, antinomies of art and culture, modernity, postmodernity, and contemporaneity, based on a conference that we did in Pittsburgh in 2004. His essential insight was that the becoming post-colonial of the world was a process in which everyone is involved, that all of us, colonized and colonizers alike, are embroiled in that legacy, and therefore we must work together to break its shackles, to create a modernity shareable by all, as I would put it, a genuine, equitable contemporaneity. Okay, so I'm aware that the purpose of this conference is to evaluate clearly, but I hope not dispassionately, the point at which major German art museums have arrived in achieving the goals of the tasks that were set before them just 6 years ago. Not just in exhibitions, but in collecting, in research, in programming, education, public profiles, and I presume also in-house, in staffing, labour relations, board memberships, mission, training. All of that has to become a global enterprise in an expanded sense of global, which I hope to fill in by the time we're finished in a few more minutes. So I can only speak as a visitor to your museums, of course, but I'll just say that globality is just one aspect of a kind of ethical searchlight that is now being shone on museums around the world. As museums become prominent amongst the diminishingly few institutions that by and large retain the trust of the publics that they serve. This is so important. As most public politics, as even some people, particularly reactionaries, question the value of universities. We never trust the advertising industry anyway. There's so few places where trust in an institution has been built up over many, many decades, and most museums are still such places. And part of what we're doing, I think, is trying to earn that trust and earn it more profoundly in the world that exists now. So as I said, I can only speak as a visitor to your museums and other ones who face similar challenges around the world. And of course I speak as an art historian who thinks a lot about what it is to learn from exhibitions, from the work of curators and museum workers, as you make art public for us in fresh, informative, inspiring, and one hopes ethical ways. So I'm not giving a definitive answer, as I said before, but I thought it could be interesting to look at the question of where are we now in reverse. What is now, where are we, what is where, what is meant by global? And after answering those questions, what would a museum be? What could it be in an expanded present, that's to say the foreseeable future? And where does art count within this, which is where that's always been the question. So I'll just give you a glimpse without going into it, because in any of my books you can find a discussion of this kind of situation. This is a structure of the modes and shifts in world thinking as I see them, moving through our present. I see various kinds of continuing modernities shaping our thinking, shaping our sense of what it is to be contemporary. I see particularly since mid-20th century, what's usually called decolonization, post-colonial, these transitional transnationalities occurring in all sorts of ways, in the forms you see here. I see between those two this kind of dialectical opposition that will never actually resolve itself except temporarily and mostly through power, force and power. I also see the emergence in the last couple of decades of different kinds of contemporaneous difference that are not locked into that First World, Second World, generational, who was in the wars, who wasn't, all those things, frameworks, but are generating a different kind of culture, network culture, communal culture, one that leads, and I hope eventually will lead for all of us towards a coeval commons that the planet needs us to arrive at. That's the deeper thing. Beyond globality, beyond becoming global, it's to become planetary, to become members of the planet. That is where we all have to get to as soon as possible, Otherwise, these concerns will disappear in the rush. So I see those kind of currents operating in the world. And I see them also shaping contemporary art and art as it is, as we understand it today, and have done for the last 30 or 40 years, becoming contemporary that's dominated by movements in Europe and the United States. But this great turning of the world, coming really in a sense from the rest of the world, that is impacting us in terms of the conference, but also dominating biennials and not so much markets because they're so deeply reactionary, capitalist, confined to relatively few people and their very specific interests. But eventually they'll be run over, they'll disappear. And the contemporary concerns emerging, as you see below. So artistic practice, if you look at any of my books, is organised in terms of these three currents moving like geological plates, along and rubbing into each other. It's also generating enormous traffic between them. A lot of artistic practice is about that traffic. So that comes up in books like this. And here's an example exactly of what we're talking about. The world is divided in terms of English-speaking publications between publishers centred in the United Kingdom and publishers centred in the United States. Who can guess which edition of my book was published in England and which one in the United States? Yeah. So there you go, colonialism. It's embedded absolutely everywhere. Tracy Rose, South African artist, performing with a gallerist who happens to be African American, obviously re-performing Rodin's The Kiss, Richard Serra on the other side. Both of them about world flows. Both of them, in one case, about powers, different kinds of power to generation and growth. One of them intensely open and vulnerable. The other one, absolutely nothing to do with vulnerable. Although maybe. So how does that impact on museums? Thinking on this kind of level, in those kind of ways. To me, there's 5 challenges to art museums in such a context. One of them is the creative destruction. That's the basis of the dominant economic systems today. Our current capitalism and our forms of neoliberalism must keep destroying public spheres, the natural environment, and everything that's of value between individuals. It's not a commodity relation. They must do that. They have to do that to survive. They will do that. Again, as well, on the other hand, the arts, particularly the visual arts, have actually generated an enormous exhibitionary complex which involves millions of people and is incredibly generative as an economy, in fact an economy in the old sense in the world today. I'll maybe come back to that a little bit later, but this is an extraordinary thing that we're part of. However, some parts of it are overdeveloped, some parts of it are massively underdeveloped. There are world tensions within it as well. There are problems with museums wanting to be modern and contemporary, or contemporary and maybe a little bit modern. There's a whole temporal issue within, but that's for another day. Then there's the fate of the object in the image world. The unsettling prospect that all collections of everything will become virtual. That deeply silly idea that is emerging in some people's minds, those who do not know that the digital world depends on actual material servers sitting in places in the United States and elsewhere that have to be kept cool, who themselves are subject to entropy. But nonetheless, that is an easy dream way out for a number of peoples, but we need to be aware of that. So I'll just illustrate the first point about creative destruction that pays no attention to the value of museums, and they end up like that, burning themselves out. And at the other end of that system I described, prefigured by Melrose, the image world. Image world spread everywhere. This is what I call the exhibitory, not the exhibitionary, but the exhibitory economy. This is an economy of images that dominates, and as Guy Debord prefigured for us, we have to update Guy Debord because what he predicted has happened. It's happened. So we must update to develop a critique of this totalizing, self-replenishing organizational form that's become this economy, the image economy. Utterly fragile, also in a state of perpetual collapse, like most of the structures I've been showing you. If you want to hear what I have to say about that in a bit more detail, on the European Graduate School's website, they have a thing called EGS videos, and if you look up the videos, I gave a lecture about that in August, on August the 15th at the school. But we're not slaves to these image worlds. Sometimes we are, to selfie culture. In the Philippines, they've even created a museum for people to go with these absolutely awful versions of Ung and Gainsborough and so on that actually move out where you can photograph yourself next to the painting. Selfie day. Jesus Christ. Anyway, there is that. That's the danger of the economy being taken in and of on its own terms rather than in a critical way. If you believe, as I do, that art making is a practice that's fundamentally oriented against spectacle, particularly that which is ubiquitous in the exhibitionary economy, we need to look at our resources, and one of them is the fact we have so many people visiting museums, which is not just a matter of numbers, it's a matter of need and desire on the part of the people who visit for something more than the economy that they're stuck in. Without looking at this in any detail, and again you can find it in any of my recent published articles, this is the visual arts exhibitionary complex, or economy as I now want to call it, which we're part of. It's an incredibly dynamic. In any city, particularly a city of this size and with Berlin's history, this is just visual arts. If you took all the other museums that you, exhibitionary places you had in Berlin, it's amazing. There's something like over 40 different kinds of platforms or venues or ways of exhibiting contemporary art or art of any kind, the visual arts, that are different in kind. Some cities have 4 or 5 examples of some of these. Many cities have very few. There's a world issue about the sort of critical mass that people feel is needed for an innovative arts economy to be working. There's all sorts of questions of that kind. You can say this is too institutionalizing and art can only exist when it resists that, which is fair enough. Let's start another exhibitionary space then. That's great, that's what you do in that circumstance. But it's also a resource. This is our resource. So we don't have just numbers of people going to art museums. We have massive infrastructure that we've developed. And we have infrastructure which also various kind of neoliberal politicians are dedicated to destroying. So this is an economy. And it leads us to, if we just think from the point of view of museums, which are a few of the elements up the top of this system, we ask the question, why do we keep on collecting? And I was actually at a conference in Seoul last year which addressed this very topic. They're producing a book, the Museum of Modern and Contemporary Art, which has various essays, including some by one of your colleagues, who I'll mention in a little while. At that conference, I tried to answer the question of why collect, not just with all the points I've made so far in this talk, some of which are platitudes, some of which are fairly obvious, other ones may be a little more subtle. But these are the reasons that we need to actually collect in our current circumstances, to resist the insane self-destruction of our prevailing economic and political systems, We have to preserve the actual artifacts of other kinds of creativity and exhibit contemporary alternative creativities, thus acting as one of the few remaining open public resources for the constructive creativities to come. And another reason, the same kind of reason, more generally put, because as Foucault says, museums are heterotopias of infinitely accumulating time, they must remain open for that which is to come from the future, from the past as it reasserts itself, and from what's happening now. So here's the fundamental paradoxical principle that drives us no matter what else we do. We have to collect art that will always be provisional and always be full of potential and always be art to come. That's the quality criteria. So I discussed those amongst other things in this book that's just come out last week from Duke University Press, where you can find all the diagrams and maps and so on I've shown you so far. Okay, so the final part of my lecture, I want to talk about globalization versus globality, and I want to try and look at it from my experience over the past year or two of how museums that I've visited, including this one, have tackled that problem. So globalization, the dominant economic, ideological, political and social order, when these issues first came up, is now in disarray and it's in decline. When I had the pleasure of speaking at the conference associated with the global contemporary art worlds after 1989, I argued that globalization was no longer the threat that we took it to be in the late 20th century. It had no chance of achieving hegemony, as the global financial crisis demonstrated. Even neoliberal globalization as a world system is coming apart. We're in transition in every aspect of our lives, and that's what Oakley and others have been trying to show in their exhibitions. When he got to the Haus der Kunst, Oakley had a chance to dream of staging a series of exhibitions that would reorient our thinking about art since 1945. You mentioned them. Post-war, art between the Pacific and the Atlantic. That's the most important thing about it. The perspective from inside the oceans out to the continents, from the wars that were actually exported to those places back towards Europe and the States and elsewhere. It was to be followed by post-colonial, 1965 to 85, which in our conversations was driven by the energy of the thinking of the great post-colonial intellectuals from Fanon onwards. That was the kind of focus and how that worked within artistic practice. That was what he was wanting to look at. And post-communist was his way of thinking about our contemporaneity, not just, immediate fall of the wall stuff, but what it was to be contemporary after the end of the formal state socialist systems, but with a kind of communism, what I call a coeval communality, as still the most vivid dream, not just a dream, but the actual necessity to deal with this sense of being planetary consciousness. The approach he took, as you also said, was profoundly art historical, profoundly revisionist art history, deliberately using that word, revisionist art history. I'll illustrate just one instance within the post-war show that demonstrates the kind of points that we're speaking about. Okay, I jumped over what I was going to tell you about art history, but let's go to the example. The example, of course, you'd expect in a post-war show, at least nowadays, to see works such as the Hiroshima panels, which I still remember as a very young schoolboy, seeing in Melbourne, where we used to have to hide in bunkers because we feared, this is like in the late 50s, a nuclear holocaust coming our way. So you'd expect works like that, even though that was usually travelled and not put in art museums, so it's a little unusual. but you may not expect to find juxtapositions like what you see here. Works by Johnson, by Johns, by Frank Whitten and Andy Warhol. You'll expect to see Andy Warhol, not necessarily the Race Riot series, and not necessarily placed next to Jack Whitten's painting, very small painting which used the same image from the race riots in Birmingham, but showed them as a bullet impacting inside a black body. So that juxtaposition is a kind of condensation of incredibly complex world historical energies and forces impacting on an individual in a specific circumstance as shown in a work of art. Condensation and concentration. And across the same room, in the same room, and this is about the United States, which is usually told as a great big story, but instead this is a nation trying to find its form with all of its faults and limitations. Here on the left, this work by Robert Indiana, you can read what it says. It's very rude about Alabama. And on the right, Larry Rivers' Death of the Last Confederate Soldier, but in the middle, at my suggestion, he put this work by Maula Marika, who's an indigenous man from northeast Arnhem Land, who had flown from his very remote community to Sydney for a conference, and conferences related to land rights, which his people actually managed to succeed in getting. And he evokes the harbour of Sydney in the shapes on the right, and all the places that he saw from the area in between belonging to indigenous people in the middle. So it's an extraordinary mixture of a way of marking the body, shaping the body, marking paintings based on body marking, thinking across a huge scale, which is usually to do with how this land has been created, but nailing it down to the experience for the first time of being in an aeroplane. Nations seeking form. This is the Aboriginal nation, the Indigenous peoples of Australia, finding their nationality again, having had it taken from them. So how can global art history contribute to this? I'll just go back, because that's back a little bit to here, because that's the slide that jumped out of place. Global art history, actually as a profession, is also learning from the art historical work of curators, even as it's also been a service discipline for museum work, at least since its professionalisation, above all in this country, during the second half of the 19th century. So where is art history now, and how does that impact on museums? So these, in a way, are the 4 or 5 great challenges confronting the discipline of art history now. How we move beyond canonical histories of schools of artists. How we move beyond the colonialist particularisms, as you see listed there. How we move beyond the discredited internationalism of modernism. The requirements of the multiple modernity projects, which is a recognition that the art cultures of every society have modernized in their particular ways, in relation to other societies modernizing at different rates and often in ways that dominated what it was to be modern. What's operating in all those interactions? Let's tell that deep story, not just one about impact and influence and belatedness and all that crap. What are the pressures that are coming from contemporary art's massively expanded near ubiquitous globalization? The thinness of contemporaneity, and so on and so forth. The distractions of spectacle I've spoken about. So these are all questions that are very parallel to what's happening in major museums. How can a major museum such as yours, and in effect, this is a whole city of one museum, You know, another way of thinking about it is a very essential way of thinking about it would be to take, and for a visitor, this is a visitor's experience. Most of the art museums in a city, for an art person, are one museum. You visit them all, you interact with them all. You see the differences, but you're actually responding to them all. And similarly, you're responding to history museums and, you know, museums that are, here's a great paradox. You're wanting to develop truly comprehensive, world-representing collections. You want to take a kind of planetary approach to displays in the collection rooms, to have an authentically worldly exhibition program, when you can show between 5 and 10% of your collection, right? Most museum building today is actually storage space. It's about building storage space, not exhibition space. There's a paradox. The heterotopia of infinitely increasing time is a temporal time bomb. It was in 1967, it's obviously even more so now. So in a certain way, we're on an explosion, we're in an explosion. And of course this explosion is occurring at a really inconvenient time. If only it would wait and we solve a few problems, it would be okay. There are never convenient times, you know, to deal with these kind of questions. But globalizing in this critical manner I've been trying to evoke for you is something that, you know, must be done. We've suffered us. So if we don't, we'll be in the same situation that women artists and artists of colour were in the 1970s. Public struggles of enormous sorts and great achievements. However, Maura Riley tells us that at Moma, the collection of works by women artists has advanced from 10% in 1972. Does anyone know where it is now? 10%. 11%, okay. And across the United States, 13% is the figure. That's just a quantitative figure. So these struggles are going to take time. But think if you're a museum in a developing country, wanting to go global in a similar sense, you're never going to have the resources and money. And anyway, why would you? Given the fact that national and regional priorities, for example in Singapore, to be the museum for the region in ways that some other places at this point can't be, but maybe will be in the future. And then there's the unpredictability of local politics. The M+ situation is going to be very interesting to observe given what's happening in Hong Kong. So finally, let me show you some images from museums my wife and I visited recently with the idea of decolonization in mind. We start with a museum devoted to so-called primitive art, as it did not name itself when it opened, the Quai Bon Lit. Show you an exhibition that's just on at the moment. The Quai Bon Lit fiercely debated its immersion in colonization in the years before and soon after its founding. And since then, it's settled into what I would call a mildly anxious forgetting. I hope that does not happen here, to be mildly anxious but to forget the challenges that are in front of you. Colonialism usually is acknowledged somewhere in the building, usually in the temporary exhibition spaces upstairs. I often show you wonderful exhibitions based on the notebooks of anthropologists that are really, you know, profiles in colonialism. Along with, of course, many beautiful artifacts. And so it is with the current exhibition. I mean, I really admire Felix Fénéon. I admire him greatly. But here he is. He's in an exhibition where in one of the first spaces, the colonial question is made very clear in the expositions and in various museums that showed primitive art. The last thing you see before you leave the show, which is work from his collection, Fénéon's collection, is an extraordinary juxtaposition of these works with the Sura next to them. you're in this kind of space where looking at naked women from two utterly different contexts is somehow presented to us as the, if you like, the psychic space of the show. It tells us we've got a long way to go. The Quai Branly has a long way to go. At the Musée National, for example, since 2010, it's struggled to become un musée global, a major revision of its mission statement. Here's a section from its report of 2010, where it actually speaks of the efforts of Moma to internationalize its collections, which so far have been poor, the Brooklyn Museum to embrace its local ethnic communities, the MFA in Houston's leadership in Latin American art, the Tate Modern in diversifying its shows and associate curators, the Reina Sofia becoming a Musée del Sud, and finally the Global Art Museum at ZKM in Karlsruhe. And here's the policy statement, which you can see is committed to mondialisation, which is much deeper, worldliness, not globalization. Multiculturalism is given a whole new geopolitical and cultural tasks, etc., etc. And it's the same set of principles we've been talking about up to date. Yet, if you look in the rooms, most of the questions are addressed by temporary shows, such as this one that's on currently, Mankomba. Another way of addressing it was to include works by at least one woman artist in each of the earlier collection rooms. That Katerina Kogro's work, total room full of Malovich's, but one of her works. The moment they've got a whole series of, the way they're presenting the collection is through the way in which contemporary, modern, or at the time contemporary art was collected by French dealers. And that's, I mean, this is a very, not only a French story, this is usually a very Parisian story. So they have not embedded this will to globality within their practice. Hello World, which I had the pleasure of seeing in this very space, was also an effort to address it. And here's how I read this exhibition, if you'll just give me a few minutes to talk about it. To me, it was a solution that depended on transforming the collection rooms plus the temporary exhibition rooms into a totally exhibitionary environment, including the bookshop. I remember you had the bookshop as part of an exhibitionary environment. Although bookshops have been exhibitionary environments for decades all around the world. Technically, you might say that the temporary exhibition took over, no longer presenting itself as an exception to the collection rooms, but as their permanent substitute. Now, but I think something further suggested, something about the future museum, the one that might become an environment of in-between spaces of the kind that I conjured at the beginning of my remarks. In-betweenness could become the main spatial organizer. So, when I looked at these spaces, I was very struck by the agora. Not so much, I thought it was too spaced. Each of the works has a certain value in and of itself, but I don't think that it actually announced the exhibition, the sense of the exhibition, as strongly as it might have, although it's actually obviously trying to do this randomness, this openness, sense that when all the statements are around the side, we got those. In a way, the last show, or the show that reflected on the exhibition, I also found very powerful. Being an art language person, I love exhibitions that look like conceptual art, like art language shows. Thanks very much, whoever did that. And again, that allowed spaces of reflection, and there were in fact people engaged in those spaces, writing and producing material. So that's a kind of positive. My friend Alfredo, a major work of his, very gestural, not making a whole lot of sense until you saw the little panel, which showed that he was tracing the journeys of refugees trying to come to this continent and get to Germany and listen to what your Chancellor said, take up her invitation. In further exhibitions, as I said, the conjunction of different kinds of development. So it was a multiple modernity show in the sense that each of the curators, Clementine and the others, picked out work that was specifically focused on its own sets of concerns, with a sense of the adjacency of what was happening at similar times in nearby countries, nearby regions, and in the dominant cultures of the time, but not facing them, directed and growing out of their own very specific concerns. The Zdenkas are here, we're partway through Zdenka's show, the next one about portable homelands, and so on. Again, this question of concentration, of finding moments that concentrate the forces in specific ways that you don't get in normal shows of art historical narratives or in those devoted to a particular artist and so on and so forth. Just one example. This conjunction I found very interesting. It's very much like the ones that I showed you in post-war. Unexpected parallelisms between two very different artists, both of them producing unusual works that don't typify their production, but addressing a human interest, in this particular case in sadism, force on bodies and so on. So when at a moment like that, we see in a flash what is utterly different, but what's also humanly shared between artists from two distinct cultural traditions. It's that moment of condensations that brings them both together, but also holds them separate in the way it brings them together. Let's see, slightly out of order. This one, sorry, I'll go on to this one. Yeah, okay, sorry, this is my order. The slides got out of order, sorry. So where do we come from? Curated by your director. It's very different in character from virtually all the other shows. It depends on a formal interplay between works by artists from very different cultures. It depends on evoking a sense of their pleasurable exchange, as if they're telling jokes to each other. That's actually the way I read that whole section. I have to tell you that in the United States, you could not put a black ape figure next to a male thinking. Explosion, total, could not do that. Not funny. But maybe here you can do it, I don't know. Anyway, so that's a particular way of dealing with the issues in front of us. But then to get to the order, there are many different important aspects to it, but this particular section, this was one in which the nuances of colonization were to be found in a lot of detail, not in a direct way, but in very interesting detail. It's a place, this is of course in Bali in Indonesia, closest to Australia, and we're very fascinated to see work that we don't see enough in Australia. So this particular section I found also very powerful and resolved and suggestive. This section was in fact the only one that addressed colonization in a very direct fashion. And in this country, you have there's a paradox. The paradox is the German quest to decolonize. One problem that you have is that the nation was late to become a nation, but was late to enter the lucrative trade of colonization. So the nation's institutions do not have as much loot to use to atone for your colonial past as other countries do. I know you have enormous and wonderful collections, but they were gathered later, and they were gathered in different ways. And so there's a kind of paradox here. Compared to France, Holland, England, and even Spain and Portugal, who were colonizers since the 16th century, and then obviously later on like that. However, when Germany did enter Africa, it did so with iron vigor, as we see here in this work by Dirk Schmidt, which I was really pleased to see in the section curated by Sven Backstetter and Azu Nwambubu, the only section that directly confronts the impacts of German colonial activity. So in his interview in Fries, Jörg Heiser made similar comments. He concludes about the show as a whole, as our introducer did, that it's only the beginning, and that decolonization should be addressed from the collection policy upwards. He drew a parallel with the Moderna Museet in Stockholm, which for decades has had a policy of collecting and showing work by women artists. And that's slowly become its default position. That's where we have to get to. In the US, parallel efforts are occurring, less using the term decolonization, because the United States, in all its amazing naivety, does not recognize itself as an empire, or at least not, except when it sends the troops. So the heading of choice is diversity, because of course the great thing to face there is the legacy of slavery, including divided cities and a huge system of incarceration. That's the most divisive social question. And it's dawning on most institutions that reparations of one kind or another must be made. So in New York this season, the reopening of Moma on October 21st is the big talked about issue. Holland Cottier in the New York Times says, will the new Moma exchange its old, cramped Paris, New York version of modernism for an inclusive and accurately global one? Will women and artists of colour finally find their rightful place in the mix? This is 2019, and they're still asking this question. In contrast, even down in Pittsburgh, during the last International, Koyo Koyo and a group of my graduate students went through the collection and displayed its colonial history in replacement of a room in which they combined art before 1300 and African art. So they made an effort to pick out works that had a certain continuity coming from different cultures, that in this case suggested the role of women of power, and so on. So it was a small but interesting effort. In Australia, our greatest struggle is, political struggle, is not just about decolonisation in the sense of recognising, not just recognising, but actually stepping back and pairing, P-A-I-R-I-N-G, becoming a pair with our indigenous peoples who were there for 40,000 years before we came. So that's been a major effort in our institutions. Art's been a very significant part of the national effort to find grounds of reconciliations. There are many setbacks. The path is difficult. People die. It is horrible. But it has on balance moved forward. This is a work of art in which must be shown as the first work of art when you enter the National Gallery of Australia in Canberra. It will always be the first work that you walk through. It's a memorial, series of memorial poles made during our bicentennial celebrations for the 200 years of white settlement for all the Indigenous people who died during that period. It also represents the growth and the energy and the animals and the peoples and the spirits who live in Rummanginning, a particular place in the Northern Territory. It's an extraordinary, critical but also constructive work. So I'll finally, in conclusion, share with you one of the most compelling articulations, I think, of this desire to be deeply, ethically worldly, truly global. One of the young people who were involved in the Global Art in the Museum project was Patrick Flores. He came to this country, worked with Hans and Andrea, and he reflected on his experience by referring to a drawing by Goya, the punishment, if you like, for being born elsewhere. It's one of the Inquisition drawings. I quote him, "It occurred to me that while in another time to be born elsewhere meant fate worthy of death, exclusion by virtue of a different genesis, but in the ecology of the contemporary to be birthed elsewhere might be a privilege. In fact, an exception by virtue of a genetic which is a natural difference. For a body to emerge in another place is to affirm a vast worldliness that enables equivalent histories and humanities to reciprocate, to demonstrate the index of belonging and the attendant violence and promise that this belonging entails in the process of, by turns, being conquered and then being in the world with others." He went on to say this, and it's a long thing, I only pick out some little bits of it, but I'll leave it there for you to think about. It's why the word global isn't enough. He thinks it may be nuanced enough if we do it diligently. It insinuates the constraints of the all. It makes us aware of the sudden vicinity of things. He talks about a thinker. That's actually was Oakway. On the one hand, there's the belief that global art is made contemporaneously all over the world, coordinated by some metastructure, neoliberal persuasion. But there's the desire to resist that, and that's truly worldly. The global contemporary lives in the same time but in different places, at discrepant rhythms, through a gamut of vectors, by its nature errant in form. So it's Glisson he's thinking of here. Errant form, but a central rootedness that is too elusive, nimble to be caught by instrumentalism. He goes on to describe it in detail, as you can read. Talks about art and the exhibition as a construction site, laboratory, a place of making and unmaking, and so on and so forth. It's a kind of art that refuses but comes from an earth that is in near exhaustion. It becomes a multitude, exhaustion, including a multitude of unimaginable poverty and persecution, but it still emerges. So when I think about exhibitionary spaces in which that kind of vision of the world is alive, I think about spaces like this, at Oakway's Venice Biennale, where he brought together the work of 3 women artists from different countries, Homa Baba from Pakistan, Ellen Gallagher from the United States, and on the back wall, Emily Ngwari, Aboriginal artist, a work of hers from 1993 called Earth's Creation, the whole world as she understood it, coming into being, coming into creation, very indigenous vision. Ellen Gallagher's vision of a kind of black world, a sort of black Atlantic, and in the front, Homa Baba's picturing of contemporary destruction of women, but also the strengths of women. So I end with this. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you so much, Terry, for taking us along on this journey of your thoughts. I personally found it very, very pleasurable to listen to you. And I would like to say that we now, so first off, my name is Jenny Dirksen, so I'm just doing this sort of as an organizational effort. We will now take time for questions, and we have put 2 microphones. One is here, over there, and one is in the other row where you can leave over there. And if you want to ask a question, you can simply go up to the microphone and ask, and you can also queue if somebody else is still talking and asking their question, so it's very practical. And you can also ask your question in either German or English, only I would like to say that if you do want to ask in German, please start by telling us so that Terry has the opportunity to put on his headphones for the simultaneous translation. And I also want to say that this conference, of course, is being recorded on video, so that just for you to be aware that your questions will also be recorded. And I also would like, I mean, if you want to ask a question, that you maybe introduce yourself first, so that we just know who's asking. Okay. And of course, if you're sort of sitting in the front, I can also come with a microphone and you don't have to get up. Okay, so if there are no immediate questions, then maybe I would like to ask a question.
Sure.
Because I'm always thinking about this. Because in your examples, I think the Moma came up quite often.
Yeah.
As did sort of other museums, sort of more in the central
Right.
places of art. And I was wondering, you know, because we talk also so much about, you know, showing, I don't know, or including sort of artists that are maybe, you know, out of this realm. But, you know, I was wondering about if the examples that we take, not as a criticism, but just, you know, because it's something that I think about a lot, what this means when we take the Moma as an example, for instance.
Okay, well, we have to learn to move beyond Moma as the reference point, obviously. Moma has been struggling to become a museum of contemporary art for the last 30 or 40 years, and I describe its efforts in the first chapter of my book, What is Contemporary Art?, which is 2009. I track its efforts from the previous years. It's not succeeded in doing so. It's just such a fantastic, or at least definitive museum of a certain profile of French modernism becoming American, that literally it finds it virtually impossible to move beyond that model. And so that every exhibition collection room where it tries to shift that a little bit, and even when it chooses artists for the solo shows, that artist becomes modernized or becomes turned into a museum of modern art, like happened to Jeff Wall, for example. The only artist who I've seen resist that is Ishka Genshin. So she had a show that actually you couldn't fit in to that kind of history. So it's a problem. It's a paradigm that keeps on collapsing in on of itself. So the whole multiple modernities approach that I mentioned, one of the obligations of the art historians is to look and show histories of museums that have developed counter stories. Obviously, very few have that are as powerful and as well resourced and as distributed. Because Moma is not just good at putting on exhibitions of a fairly formal kind, it has the best archives of any museum that you want to look at most accessible archives. It funds people to do that. So it writes its own history before many other museums did. However, Moma did something that no other museum did in such a consistent way. So we must praise Moma's documents series, the series of publications that they've made that document, beginning with Eastern Europe and right up now the latest one, the Arab world. They made a whole series of books that get together primary documents. So this is the primary documents series. And they've done that on the basis of having groups of people who all, they have collectors groups and curatorial groups that go all around the world and discuss things with people. And they try and collect some works for Moma, and that's nice. But the actual most positive outcome is this primary document series. So we praise them for that and hope that that spirit somehow infuses the rest of the museum. But we will see in a couple of weeks' time. We'll see what they manage to do. Okay, any more questions? Yes, please. Gentleman there, yeah. I realise I talk for a long time. I'm sorry to keep you for so long.
Thank you. I had to make my way to the microphone. Thank you so much for your presentation.
Thank you.
The question I have is about the relationship to your interest in post-coloniality, and and ultimately how that becomes edified seems to be in examples you've been showing in objects, paintings and sculptures and things that museums can collect. And I'm wondering if you have, if you've found any examples of curatorial or other kind of museographic examples that seem to challenge or seem to take on the post-colonial towards rethinking the ways in which these practices are supported and curated by institutions outside of the canon of objects that we know.
Right. Okay. The examples I gave looked object-oriented because there's just one slide with a few objects in it. They're rare, and they're glancing. It's often glancing, you know, it's often occasional. So it's clearly often the case that there is a curator, usually a younger curator in a museum, who managed to inflect part of an exhibition with a post-colonial perspective. Obviously, the post-war show was post-colonial in the clearest way because it paid equal attention to the decolonizing activities that occurred throughout the world. It had a whole section devoted to the non-aligned movement as the basis that generated a huge amount of the art in the show. So in a certain way, that's a fairly clear local model of what a genuinely decolonized, post-colonial exhibition would look like. Part of the reason it's difficult to answer your question is that the theorization of post-coloniality is very developed. The theorization of decolonization is less developed and it's very Latin American in orientation and character. So there are efforts going on throughout Latin America to create exhibitions and practices that are decolonizing. But the essential element is it goes back to not just white people making a decolonial style exhibition. It goes back to actually training and appointing indigenous curators, training and appointing curators, etc., etc. Education people, eventually museum directors. Imagine a person like Oakley becoming the director of a major world museum, something he never, in a way, major collection museum. You know, that to me, there's an African-American gentleman just appointed head of the Smithsonian institutions in the United States just a few months ago. Last year. Very rare. So my answer is, it has to be done all the way through. If you're looking for, is there a particular exhibitionary style or manner or form that is decolonial, I don't think so. But that's worthy of a bit more thought, I think. I'm not going to give you an answer just like that. But that is a question worthy of serious thought. So thank you for that. Any more? Everybody hungry? Everybody tired? Okay, that's it.
Ah, okay, there's a...
Oh, one there, sorry. Please, go ahead. Yeah. We can't hear you. Please, my hearing is not that great.
Hi, my name is Hannes Brunner and I'm an artist, and I'm just occurred to me one differentiation between the American way of looking at the culture of diversity, as you mentioned it,
Right.
and rather coming out of Europeans' experience and epistemological views, the post-colonial discourse and decolonization efforts in the museum. Shouldn't we rather work on this rather huge difference between these two poles than talk about the general global museum which we can't reach?
Okay. So the we in your sentence is a we that encompasses both Europeans and Americans. So who is the we in your sentence?
I don't
That's
know.
the word. No,
The we, yeah, I mean, I found it quite interesting how you address, I mean, the effort to think about a global museum in general, and wir schaffen das. However, I think we have two different approaches, basically run since 200 years, let's say, since the Enlightenment, since the foundation of the Bill of Rights of the US, which definitely gives another aspect of dealing with empowerment of a society, and through this also another history about it. And that also leaves us another differentiation about dealing with the neighborhood, let's say, in a global museum way.
Okay, so the neighborhood is very important to deal with, because the neighborhood is going to be filled with people who are not in the neighborhood. Yeah. And so, in a way, as I hinted throughout my talk, there's a much larger demand on museums and on art and on us, on all of us, than becoming global, even in the nicest possible way. And that is, it's to become actually members of a planet. It's to become people of a world. That includes the natural world that we're destroying. I can go into a whole lot of points about it. I don't have to. It's obvious what's occurring there. But it is a larger target. It's the thing that needs to, as it were, frame the movement towards a more global, more inclusive museum. If museums are going to be places where really difficult public questions can be thought through in environments which are not safe environments, okay? In America they have the expression, museums are great places for difficult questions to be discussed in a safe, pleasant, nice manner. Some things are not going to be subject, it's not going to be too nice, you know. So somehow museums, you know, Tristram Hunt talks about the V&A as such a place, you know. So somehow museums, like libraries and these very few places that are in effect financed by the people, for the good of the people in this deeply democratic sense, have to face and work out ways of discussing questions that go way beyond the United States or Europe or this or whatever. Become this worldly connected, totally planetary, deeply endangered, very difficult environment. But I understand your country has absorbed enormous numbers of people, more than any other European country. And so it's done a moral good that is admired around the world. So if it can be done on an everyday level, you know, we have to think of a way of doing it in a museum, I would say, yeah. So.
Okay, so yeah, thank you once again. And if there are no other questions, I hope you will all rejoin us tomorrow at, so the conference starts at 10:30 a.m., but if you were part of the queue lining up for the registration, you know, you might want to get the idea to come a little bit earlier tomorrow to have time to do that. Yes, and so I thank you all very much for attending, and have a pleasant evening.
Okay.